On today's episode of Useless Thoughts, our topics will be a little more serious than the lighthearted discussions on prior episodes. First, we're going to consider what topics or issues that we know nothing about. And on the second part of the show, I want to discuss the frustration of not being able to see two different outcomes to any situation. Let's take a deeper dive into both of these issues on today's episode. So why don't you drop the small talk and let's do this.
Sitting on top of the world, I don't know if you heard. I'm living it up, yeah, I ain't gonna stop and I can't hear a word. Good vibes up in the air, and I got plenty to share. So come pick it up, there's tons to be got, and I'm spreading it everywhere. So call it luck and let it run amok. I'm telling your friends it's time to let the good times roll.
This is the Useless Thoughts Podcast, a place where no thought is too random and no topic is too pointless. Let's have some real conversation. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 9 of the Useless Thoughts Podcast. Only one more episode left after this one in Season 1. We released our first episode a couple months ago, and if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. Time flies when you're making podcasts. Whether you're a first-time listener or a dedicated fan from the very beginning, I thank you for listening to the show. And I'm actually have a Useless Thoughts t-shirt in my possession as we speak, which clearly shows the booming success that the show has been thus far. Some general housekeeping before we begin. I received some minor flack regarding episode 7, I believe it was, where we informed the fantasy football players that no one cared about their fantasy team. I wanted to make amends for the attacking nature of the episode and issue a public statement regarding that on today's show, so here is my follow-up statement. I just took a DNA test and it turns out that still no one cares about your fantasy team. Alright, that felt good to get off my chest, and I'm glad that we could come to a resolution today. Moving on to the actual episode. We all have things that we don't know anything about. Obviously, it's impossible to understand every subject in the world, so there's going to be some gaps in anyone's knowledge. As a bit of an aside to go along with that, don't be that person that never says, I don't know. Sometimes people are so terrified or embarrassed of saying, I don't know, and think that they have to have the answer for any issue that's brought up. Don't be that guy or girl. But there are some things that are relatively basic that I think we all choose to know nothing about. This is going to vary from person to person, and the reasons for choosing ignorance will vary too, but I do believe we all have certain things that we choose to know nothing about. Politics is a big one here. Some people, and I would probably include myself here, think that it's maddening to try to keep up with it all, and that it's better to just try and ignore all of it. So then whenever you're asked about, hey, did you hear what Mr. Politician said at the obviously extremely interesting debate yesterday? You can say no and proceed with your day. History is another one where people choose ignorance. Most of this is probably due to boredom or not seeing the relevance, but I think a lot of people choose to not know anything about history. And not to mention, it's such a vast subject that requires a lot of time to study and fully comprehend how it all ties together. You can probably think of some others, but those are the big two that I thought of. I have one that applies to me that I think is a little more outside the box. I choose to know almost nothing about nutrition. Now, I don't mean I try to eat as unhealthy as possible, but what I mean is I still haven't figured out what a carb is. Most of us have been to an all-you-can-eat buffet before, and I've always heard people say after they eat at a buffet that they ate way too many carbs. So I've taken that comment and like to throw it out there sometimes after I eat a big meal. Now, I have zero idea what foods have a lot of carbs and which ones don't, so whenever I throw this comment out there, I'm always on the edge of my seat for about 2 seconds, waiting to see if someone agrees or if they call my bluff and tells me that nothing we ate had any carbs in it. It's quite an adrenaline rush to try this, which I'm sure any of you have experienced if you try to act like you knew something that you had actually no knowledge of. Another one that people mention is starches, which as I Google it now actually appears to be a subset of carbs. When you go to what the people call a sit-down restaurant, sometimes you get the option to have 2 sides with your entree. Now, 2 of my favorite sides are some kind of potatoes, whether it's mashed potatoes, baked potatoes, something like that, and corn on the cob. And it's been said to me by someone at the table as I place this order, wow, really loading up on the starches I see. To which I reply, "Oh yeah, starches. Well, don't think any less of me. I just decided to splurge a little bit on this meal because I do try to limit my starch intake on weekdays because I definitely know about starches and to not eat too many starches." And really, how was I supposed to know the food pyramid that we were all brainwashed with in grade school was not to be trusted? This was a good meal according to the pyramid. Oh, and who in the world can figure out how fats work? You hear the word and the average person is going to think, well, I should probably avoid fats. But then it comes out, well, some fats are good if you handle them right. It just has to be the right kind of fat. So you have your saturated fat and trans fat, and there's a clear difference here, obviously. Now, I have no idea what kind of fat to trust. And now I'm sitting here wondering why we don't incorporate some saturated skinny into our foods every now and then. Maybe this all makes me dumb, and that's okay. But I know some of you out there have subjects like that. Things that a lot of people know about, and you, at some point in your life, chose to not learn anything about it. And the struggle with these things is that eventually you realize that you've gotten too old, and to admit now that you never learned anything about it would be way too embarrassing, so you have to pretend for the rest of your life like you do when the subject comes up by repeating something you've heard someone say in the past about it. But maybe it's time we change that. I normally give the advice at the end of the show, but maybe it's best here. It's easier than ever to learn about anything due to the information at our fingertips, so maybe we should all try to learn about something this week that we know nothing about. Maybe next time you hear my voice, I'll be the biggest expert on carbs that you've ever heard. So ask yourself the question, what is the subject that you don't know anything about? Don't let me be the only one that sounds like a dummy. Today's episode is brought to you by toilets that don't flush automatically. Early on, we had an episode brought to you by My Toilet, so clearly we're very grateful to have the full support of the bodily waste industry. We really thought we had progressed as a society when we got automatic flushing toilets, because then we would save that valuable 0.7 seconds every time we used a public restroom. Plus, we didn't have to touch the bacteria-infested handle, right? Well, chalk this one up to unintended consequences, because little did we know that the slightest tilting of our body would lead to a sudden whoosh, an instant rush of cold air, leaving us feeling vulnerable and afraid because we still had business to take care of, and the computer that we're sitting on decided that our time was up. Now, scared to move a muscle again, the whole process becomes uncomfortable and nerve-wracking. You're on the edge of your seat, quite literally, hoping to cover the sensor with your back. The poor people that have narrow shoulders are just doomed from the get-go. Well, that's why we are glad to be sponsored by Manual Toilets. If you're worried about germs from touching the handle, that's what the bottom of your shoe is for. And now you can flush when you're good and ready, not when a software developer decides your time is up. So next time you see a manual flushing toilet, I want you to think about this podcast. Toilets are a great invention, and some devices are best left alone. Let's keep computers and sensors out of our bathrooms and make toilets great again. All right, back to the show. I'll warn you about this next topic, that it's a little out there, maybe slightly philosophical, so I won't blame you if you hate this part. One of my biggest annoyances in life is that you can never see two or more outcomes to a situation. If you take one path and make a decision, perhaps it doesn't work out and you're left regretting not taking the other decision. But the problem with that logic is that you're assuming that the other decision would have worked out better than your actual choice, which might not necessarily be true. It may have, in fact, turned out worse. But there's no way to know the outcome, so you're left regretting it forever. Let me paint a scenario to help illustrate what I'm talking about. Imagine you're mad at a coworker that lied to you about something, but you don't want to hurt their feelings in the moment and right away by confronting them about it, so you just roll with it and try your best to forget about it. Well, you might can bottle it up for a while, but around a year later it finally bursts out of you and you let them have it about the lie because it's built up over time. Well, obviously the coworker is going to be taken aback by this, and then they're mad and upset at you and say, well, if you had just brought this up in the first place right when it happened, we could have worked it out right then and been fine. So now you're made to feel guilty about doing what you thought was polite in that time and what you thought was the best way to handle it. And now it's assumed that you made the mistake in handling it. Well, the problem is we can't see the other outcome. You see, it's very possible that the coworker would have been livid when you confronted them immediately and gotten mad at you for accusing them of being a liar, and the situation would have blown up and been immensely worse than the way that you actually handled it. You see this a lot in sports. Since the World Series is going on right now, we'll take baseball for example. Say there's a starting pitcher that's doing well, but then around the 7th inning he starts to get tired. Now the manager has a decision. Does he leave that pitcher in and try to finish the inning of the game? Or does he bring in a relief pitcher? And if he brings in a relief pitcher, which one does he bring in? Well, if the team ends up winning, then the manager is talked about for how smart he is and how shrewd he was with his personnel decisions, even if he was just completely guessing and hoping it worked out. But if the team ends up losing the game, now the manager is accused of making a terrible decision, and the media can't believe how dumb that manager is. Well, that's the problem. Say he left a starting pitcher in and he gives up the winning hit. Now everyone's going to say, why didn't he pull him out? Well, in an alternate reality, maybe the relief pitcher would have done the same thing and might have even given up more runs. Maybe every other scenario that would have played out would have resulted in a loss as well. But the manager gets blamed for being wrong in this scenario where there actually would have never been a right answer no matter how many different ways he tried to do it, because they all would have resulted in a loss. Obviously, this is just a fantasy world I'm living in thinking about this, and maybe this only makes sense to me as I ramble here about it. But sometimes I do think it would be interesting being able to see how something would have ended up if a different approach had been taken. The way that our minds work, it seems that we're always left thinking that if something doesn't work out, then we made the wrong decision, and the opposite decision would have been the right one. But that may not necessarily be true. The other decisions may not have worked out either, and may have actually been much worse. I don't even exactly know what I'm arguing for here, which is why I said this topic is a little out there, other than just pointing out the frustration of us always thinking with hindsight that the opposite decision was the right decision, when it's just as likely that that decision wouldn't have been any better and actually might have been worse. Just something to think about. Thanks for supporting the show today and making it all the way to this point. I hope you'll spread the word about the show if you can, and drop a review or rating if possible. If you prefer listening on YouTube, you can find us at the Useless Thoughts podcast channel there as well. Doesn't seem that many people do, but that option is out there. And make sure to check back next week, as we will have our final episode of Season 1. We will have a Season 2, but just letting you know that next week's episode will be the 10th and final episode of Season 1. If you have any suggestions, improvements, criticisms, feedback, episode ideas, topics, things like that, anything, send that to me at uselessthoughtspodcast@gmail.com. I hope you all have a great week. Remember to show kindness to everyone, and let's make the world a better place.